playing Resident Evil 7 in a way that I don't want to keep playing Amnesia Rebirth. Because in Resident Evil 7, I know that if I stick with it, if I can get through the really terrifying parts, eventually there's going to be a part where the game gives me a chainsaw again. Whereas Rebirth is only ever going to get worse. That's what I mean when I say, unlike a lot of other horror games, Resident Evil 7 is actually a good video game. It's a game I actually want to keep playing, and it's still scary. Let me return to my first point, which is simply that Biohazard is a masterpiece of horror because it's really, really scary. Before I say anything else about Biohazard, I want to talk a little bit about Resident Evil 8 Village. Village is a fantastic game. I had a total blast with it. Village also mixes horror and hilarity in similar ways to Biohazard. It also expertly balances feelings of being powerful and powerless for the player. However, I would not call Village a masterpiece of horror, because it's not that scary. Resident Evil 8 is this awesome, bombastic action experience where you're battling Lycans and vampires and cyborgs, and it's great, but I never found it very scary, except for once. And if you're at all familiar with Village, I guarantee you know which section of the game I'm about to discuss. This is House Beneviento. Here, all of that bombastic, over-the-top action dissolves. The game takes away all your weapons, and suddenly you're just trapped in the cramped and dark basement of a creepy house. And it's scarier than anything that came before it. The whole time I was playing this section, I felt this creeping, rising dread, like something terrible was about to happen. And the game perfectly fulfills that feeling of dread when this freaking crazy baby fetus monster shows up. House Beneviento is scary in a way that the rest of Village isn't, because it's quiet. It's scary because it's simple. And that's Biohazard. That's exactly what makes Biohazard so scary. Back at the start of this video, I said that Resident Evil 7 took horror back to its basics. A creepy house, a couple of freakish characters, and some inhuman monsters. That formula for horror is so perfect. It wouldn't matter how well Biohazard mixed the horror and the hilarity, or the powerful and the powerless. If it wasn't scary enough, it wouldn't be a masterpiece of horror. But it is scary, and that's because of its simplicity. You, alone, exploring a haunted house. I think it's important that so much really good horror takes place in such simple domestic settings. The best horror takes things that are familiar to us and makes them unfamiliar. Shows us the horror line underneath the surface of spaces we think we're familiar with. Shows us how strange and terrible our seemingly ordinary world can be. Remember earlier in the video when I talked about this moment, when you look down these dark stairs and you can hear that terrible raspy breathing? This moment is scarier than almost anything in Resident Evil 8, or any other Resident Evil game, and it's so simple. The lights are off and there's something in the house with you, and you don't know what it is. You can hear it, but you can't see it. Biohazard reduces horror to its most basic elements. A dark room is scary. A thump or creak in the night whose source you don't know is scary. A man chasing you down the hall is scary. Just the knowledge that you are not alone in this house. Somewhere in here, there is someone or something looking for you. That is scary. Something really small but effective about Biohazard's visual design is all the clutter and filth in this house. This house is a mess. I think horror is fundamentally the opposite of comfort. There's no such thing as being afraid when you're feeling comfortable. And I don't mean physical comfort. You can be in a comfy bed and still be terrified of that noise you just heard downstairs. I mean psychological comfort. You cannot psychologically get comfortable until you figure out what the heck that noise was downstairs. And this is why humor doesn't ruin horror. We've all laughed in uncomfortable situations. It's very possible to both laugh and be uncomfortable. And that's where the mess in this house comes in. When you're in a truly disgusting environment, when you are surrounded by filth and dirt and grime, it's not possible to be truly comfortable. In this house, the developers crafted an environment in which you cannot ever truly get comfortable. Even when you're not getting chased by an axe murderer. Even when you're not battling a mold monster. And they accomplished that with something as small as filth. Darkness is another one. It can be hard to get totally comfortable in a dark environment because you just can't see what's out there. You're pretty sure there aren't any ghosts or monsters or axe murderers in that dark hallway, but you can't actually be certain because you can't see. You can't get totally 100% psychologically comfortable until you turn on the light. Biohazard uses darkness perfectly. When it wants you to feel a little more comfortable, like in this upstairs area, it turns on the lights. It's surprising how comfy looking some of the areas in this game are, or at least could be with a little cleanup. That's another lesson Biohazard could teach other horror games. Not every single space in your game has to look like literally hell on earth. A balance between horror and comfort is more effective, because the seesaw makes the horrific parts scarier by contrast. And when this game does want you to feel really, really scared, like down in this basement, or in this attic area, or in the bowels of this oil tanker, which are some of the scariest parts of the game, it drops you into total darkness. I know it sounds simple, but that's the point. Biohazard uses very simple techniques, like light and darkness, to craft a really frightening experience. Another little side note about comfort, and this applies to the entire Resident Evil franchise. The Resident Evil games have very little music. They tend to be pretty quiet. The one place where you'll always hear music, though, is inside their safe rooms. In Resident Evil, a safe room is a room the monsters can't enter. In here, you can catch your breath, manage your inventory, and save your game. And there's always music playing, usually some kind of slow-paced, downbeat, relaxing music.
Condor 1 to Roost. I found the key to the church.
Copy that.
Condor 1 to Roost.
Copy that. Now go.
Have you ever wondered why? Why do the developers do this? It has to do with comfort. Horror is all about making you feel uncomfortable, but in these safe rooms, the developers don't want you to feel scared. They want you to feel comfortable. So they play a little music. If the safe room is the only room in the entire game where music is playing, then the safe room feels distinctly more comfy than every other room. It's a really smart piece of sound design. I've always been impressed by it. Biohazard's horror is also enhanced by its level design. This house is full of long, narrow hallways, with sudden tight corners you can't see around. Over and over in this game, the developers place enemies right around a corner that you can't see until it's already on top of you. It means you have to approach every corner with caution. The hallways are always just long enough to give you time to feel anxious about what's around that next corner. The design also means that whenever you're being chased, you have a long way to go before you reach safety. You'll have to run down these long hallways with an enemy right on your heels and nowhere to escape to. This house's design is maze-like and strange. You'll find like 12 different living rooms and dens as you explore the place, some completely hidden inside secret passages. It all looks familiar, but it also doesn't make any sense. Like, what psychopath would design a home this way? When you're running through this house, it can feel a bit like you're running through some kind of bizarro funhouse mirror reflection of how a house should be arranged. Something else that's really effective in Biohazard is its enemy design. Most enemies in the game are these mold creatures called the Molded. Humans who have been consumed by a kind of sentient mutant black mold. I find these Molded far more unsettling than the zombies in most other Resident Evil games. There's something alien and inhuman about them, like their faces, which look like giant gaping black mouths full of razor-sharp teeth, or the way they move. Their movements are wobbly, viscous, and liquid-like. There's something non-solid about them. They move in ways that shouldn't be possible for a human being. They also tend to move really slowly at first, then suddenly jump forward. It makes me panic almost every time it happens. Next, notice their size. They are freaking huge. They are way bigger than the player character. They are physically imposing. Imagine how much less scary they would be if they were regular sized or smaller. They're also really quiet. They never scream or roar. The only noise they ever make is this quiet gurgling sound as they slowly shamble towards you. They're really good at sneaking up behind you or hiding around a corner, which is aided by the game's level design. There's long hallways and tight corners. Resident Evil 7 is scary in all these small, simple ways. It's so expertly crafted. It should serve as a lesson for all horror developers everywhere, including the developers of all future Resident Evil games. When you're developing a horror game and you have the choice between going big or going small, a lot of times you should go small. It's the difference between terror and dread. Terror is loud, in your face. Terror is jump scares. Dread is that slowly building anxiety that something very bad is about to happen. It's the subtle things that scare the most. And yet, Biohazard is better at going loud than almost any other horror game, because it earns those moments. When you pick up that chainsaw during the face-off with Jack Baker, that's not just one more in a long series of cool action movie moments. That's the payoff of hours of trembling and sneaking through this freak show Bayou Manor. Hours of feeling powerless and afraid. It's the combination of the two that makes Resident Evil 7 a masterpiece of horror. The expertly balanced combination of subtlety and bombast, horror and hilarity, dread and terror. In preparation for the release of the Resident Evil 4 remake, I've been playing some of the games and watching a lot of videos with clickbaity titles like The Scariest Moment from Every Resident Evil Game and Top 20 Scariest Moments in Resident Evil Games, and reading articles like 10 times Resident Evil was actually scary. These lists mention a lot of the same things over and over again, like the giant fetus baby monster thing in Resident Evil 8, which is pretty freaking terrifying. Or just everything about Nemesis in the original Resident Evil 3, or the battle against the weird insectoid mutated Marguerite in Resident Evil 7, or this creepy, silent, staring old lady whose head slowly turns to watch you wherever you go in Resident Evil 7, or everything about the nearly immortal and hilarious axe murderer Jack Baker in Resident Evil 7, or everything about Mr. X relentlessly stomping after you through the police station in the Resident Evil 2 remake. But I haven't seen any of them mention what I personally remember as one of the scariest moments in the series. So today I've got a bit of clickbait of my own. Here's the true scariest moment in any Resident Evil game ever. Whoa! Okay, I don't know if this is really the scariest moment ever in the series, but it is a moment that really scared me, and I think it's worth examining to see exactly how the developers crafted this particular scare. I want to take a close look at Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. I already posted a video discussing some of the things that make 7 one of the best horror games ever made, so I don't want to rehash anything I already said there. Instead, I want to zoom in on one specific moment in the game. This stairwell and door leading down to a basement. Seriously, I'm just going to spend this entire video talking about this one door. I really think it's that impressive. Resident Evil 7 was all about a subtler, quieter kind of horror than most of the rest of the series. Horror founded on a sense of slowly creeping dread and irresistibly rising tension.
Okay.
And this door leading to the basement exemplifies that kind of subtle and quiet horror. But before you understand what makes this door so scary to me, you have to understand everything that leads up to it. In the first chapter of the game, you are exploring this huge, dark, dilapidated, disgusting Bayou Manor. The visual and audio design of this setting are absolutely perfect. It looks and sounds really scary. The rooms are dark, foreboding, and full of filth, and sometimes you can find patches of a strange black and gooey substance. It feels like a place that once upon a time was a cozy and welcoming family home, but something very wrong has happened here. And it's not cozy or welcoming at all anymore. The setting is very quiet. Most of the time all you can hear is your own character's footsteps, and some strange bumps and scrapes whose sources you can't place. And you can never tell if those bumps and scrapes are just a part of a creepy background auditory ambiance, or if it's the sound of a monster nearby who's about to make you poop your pants. Because there are enemies searching for you here. While exploring this bayou manor, you are being hunted by Jack Baker, the terrifying and sort of hilarious patriarch of the Baker family. If he spots you, which he will again and again, he chases you through the maze-like halls of this house, calling out taunts and dark jokes as he tries to murder you. The whole experience is really, really scary. It's one of the scariest games I've ever played. But here's an important point. All of this genuine terror occurs either on the ground floor or up on the second floor. It's only after fully exploring both that you reach this staircase leading down into the basement. And when I first saw this staircase and that door at the bottom, I instantly knew things were about to get way, way worse. As scary, intense, and stressful as everything leading up to this moment was, I could tell just by looking that things were about to get a whole lot worse. Because now we're going down into the basement, baby. I want to pause here to discuss how basements function in horror stories. Across so many novels, movies, and video games, so much horror occurs in basements. So many monsters seem to have a preference for creeping and crawling in basements instead of in a kitchen or living room. Have you ever wondered why that is? Why do horror authors and filmmakers and game developers keep returning to this same sort of space? There is something inherently frightening about the basement as a setting. The average basement tends to be a bit scarier than most other rooms in the house. There are several reasons for this, and the first has to do with familiarity. Horror is all about discomfort, spaces and sounds and visuals that make you feel uncomfortable. The more time you spend in a particular space, the more familiar you will feel with that space, and the more familiar you are, the more comfortable you will feel, the less scared you will feel. This is why horror games tend to seem less scary the longer you play. The more familiar you get with their mechanics, their monsters, their methods of scares, the more comfortable you will feel and the less scared you will feel. This is why most horror games tend to be pretty short. It works the same way in the rooms of a house. Most people spend less time in their basements than in other rooms of the house, and so the basement will always remain this relatively unfamiliar space in your home, and so will always be at least a little bit scarier than other rooms. Let's go back to that idea of comfort. Most basements are not fully finished or fully furnished, so they won't have all those little pleasing, comforting visual touches that the rest of the house does. Those little background details you usually don't even notice, things like completed floors and walls. An unfinished or unfurnished basement will be by nature utilitarian and comfortless in design. And because it's less comfortable, it will also be inherently at least a little more prone to being scary. Finally, there is lighting. Basements tend to be underground. They tend not to have much, if any, natural lighting. They are naturally darker than other rooms in your house. And because darkness affects comfort too, it also affects how potentially scary the space can appear. If you spend a bunch of time in your basement, fully finish and furnish it, and turn on all the lights, it won't seem scary anymore. It's the lack of all those things that make basements seem scarier than other rooms in the house. So let's get back to Resident Evil 7. This house is scary no matter what floor you're on. The whole thing is completely terrifying. But then you reach these stairs leading down to the basement and you know that it's about to get worse. Because basements are always worse. In any horror media anywhere, you never want to go down to the basement. The basement always sucks. Basements in real life usually suck. And this is a horror game. If the basement in the average, totally normal townhouse is kind of scary, just imagine how scary the basement in this already really scary house is going to be. This basement is going to be terrifying, and you have to go down there. If you want to keep progressing in the game, you have to descend those stairs. So many horror games will throw players into a scary situation against their will. For example, when a monster suddenly bursts through a door or window and starts chasing you. That's the developers putting you in a scary situation without any choice on your part. That's less scary to me because I don't have any agency. It'll happen no matter what I do. I might as well be watching a cutscene. But you have to choose to descend these stairs. You have to consciously will yourself down into a scary situation, knowing it's going to be scarier than anything else you've encountered so far. The visual design here is absolutely perfect too. The stairs themselves are dark and plain, and there's a single light illuminating the white door at the bottom. Your attention is immediately drawn all the way to the bottom of the staircase, to that door. The door itself is completely bland. Nothing about its design gives you any hint of what kind of horrors await behind it, which only heightens the tension, because you know horrors are waiting behind it. You just have no clue what form they will take. As you descend, it feels like the staircase is just long enough to give you enough time to imagine all the horrible things that might be waiting for you once you reach the bottom, and then you're there. Something I noticed going through those lists of scariest moments in the Resident Evil series is that the lists were filled with jump scares. Jump scares can be terrifying, but they're only ever terrifying for a single moment. I'm much more impressed by the sustained scare, a dread or terror that lasts. And this door is a dread that lasts, because once you enter this basement, it's worse. It's so much worse than anything you imagined. It's immediately completely terrifying. It is so dark down here. All of the walls and floors are covered in this sticky, grotesque black mold that is growing and oozing everywhere. Up to this point in the game, you've only encountered maybe one of these mold monsters, but once you start exploring the basement, you are surrounded by them. Some of them literally spawn behind you, slowly and quietly creeping up on you. Their visual design is horrific. They have tons of health and take forever to go down. Their animations are so wobbly that their heads are almost impossible to aim for. They spawn right out of that black oozing mold, so they can appear anywhere at any time. And it just keeps getting worse. Down here you discover evidence of the torture and experimentation the Baker family has been inflicting on the people they kidnapped. You find bathtubs filled with this mold, which were apparently used for transforming corpses. You find a morgue filled with the names of the dead and descriptions of their fates. There's at least one vague mention of rape. The basement makes excellent use of sound design too. Most of the basement is disconcertingly quiet until you reach this engine room, which is so loud that you can't hear anything else, including any sounds the monsters surrounding you make while they're sneaking up on you. You thought you hated the quiet, but you'll discover that you hate a space that's really loud even more. And it still keeps getting worse, because at the very heart of this basement, you're destined for a claustrophobic confrontation with the seemingly immortal and unstoppable Jack Baker, a one-on-one oversized power tool battle that is easily one of the most impressive in the entire series, if only for how cramped and brutal it is. That's what makes this staircase and the door to the basement one of the most memorable scares in the series for me. It is quiet and subtle. It builds off of hours of terror that have preceded it, and this scare is sustained. You see that door, and you know things are about to get really bad, and they actually do get really bad. The promise of terror is totally fulfilled. Things just keep getting worse after this door. So much worse even than you had imagined. When I think of truly perfect scares in the Resident Evil series, sure, that weird baby fetus monster thing was pretty freaky. And sure, Mr. X was tremendously well designed from a gameplay perspective, but it's the quieter bits of terror that really stick with me years after. In this door, this staircase, as simple as it may seem, as forgettable as they may have been to you, for me this is one of the most perfectly crafted moments of subtle dread to be found in the entire franchise.
I'm not running back and save.
Oh, nothing but the finest ways.
In some ways, the gameplay of Breath of the Wild can feel at odds with its narrative. Here we have a story about the destruction of an entire kingdom, of horrific devastation and loss of life, the looming threat of a second disaster on the horizon, the final snuffing out of life in this land, which is perhaps only days away. The potential end of all life is approaching. This is a dire situation. If you took the story seriously, you should feel anxious. You should be rushing to stop Calamity Ganon as soon as possible. But that's not how most of us played the game. Most of us spent hours and hours just farting around, collecting Korok seeds, solving little side quests, searching for treasure. There is no anxiety in this gameplay. There is no rush. The lackadaisical game design encourages you to take your time. This world is not an anxious one, not even a very violent one. The world of Breath of the Wild feels peaceful. It's very pretty. The soft color palette, all the wild nature everywhere, the quiet, low-tempo soundtrack. It can all be very soothing. It's a world that I want to spend a lot of time in. It's a world that relaxes me. When I first played the game, I thought this tragic story and peaceful fun gameplay didn't match each other at all. But nowadays I think it's actually the opposite. Those two seemingly contradictory elements are really essential to each other. Because Breath of the Wild story is, at its core, a story about failure and tragedy, but also about overcoming that failure. About finding joy and beauty in the world even after a tragedy has occurred, finding reasons to live in a tragic world. I'm going to start this essay by discussing the game's world design, this peaceful playground the developers have created, and then discussing the horror that underlies that seemingly peaceful world, and then how the narrative's themes of failure and overcoming failure tie it all together. So, Breath of the Wild's gameplay, like a lot of Nintendo games, is all about joy and silliness and finding the fun in all these little details. These little interactions with the world that most other games wouldn't bother with. Despite its massive scale, its huge open world, its story that spans millennia, with the fate of the entire world at stake, Breath of the Wild often feels to me like a very small-scale game. So much about its game mechanics and world design are about finding fun in little things. I was at my happiest in this game when I was simply exploring a little green-shaded wood, picking some mushrooms off the ground, seeing squirrels and birds skittering among the underbrush, climbing a tree and finding a bird's nest, while that delightful little bit of piano music plays, and the wind is rustling and you hear the tittering of the birds. You can chop the trees down for wood, you can pick apples for food, you can even accidentally light the whole place on fire. Or when I climbed a tall hill or small mountain and you look out and it feels like this whole world is spread out beneath you, and the terrain is rolling and so very green, and maybe it's sunset and the landscape has turned pink, or maybe it's raining and atmospheric, but either way, every vista in this game felt like its own reward. Every landscape a painting, and every single thing you can see, every tree, every mountain, every valley, that's a place you can go right now. There's a wonderful sense of freedom to it. Or when I was exploring some ruins, some 100-year-old crumbling fortress, littered with moss-covered husks of ancient broken machines, left over from a forgotten battle, or maybe an abandoned village where every single villager is long gone, or even just a single lonely shack on a green hill, and letting my imagination loose, imagining what life might have been like in this place before all the death and destruction, when every fortress was manned by marching soldiers and every village was alive with the sounds of work and play, and even those lonely shacks were inhabited by some family, some old hermit living on the frontier. I've often heard people describe Breath of the Wild's open world as empty, or say that there wasn't enough to do or not enough to find. And while I do understand those criticisms, and I think there's some validity to them, I also believe there is something difficult to describe within this game's world design that if you don't get it, you just don't get it. I like riding my horse along the paths, I like climbing the hills, I like collecting mushrooms or hunting for deer, I like jumping off a tower and seeing how far I can glide. There is a simple joy in these acts that feel silly and pointless when you try to explain them to others, but in the moment feel very satisfying and fun. You have to experience it for yourself. You have to let yourself take it slow. Give yourself permission to waste time and not even bother trying to accomplish anything. Just enjoy meandering around this beautiful and usually peaceful playground the developers have gifted to us. Breath of the Wild reminds me a lot of Studio Ghibli's films. A lot of those movies have these grand, exciting adventure stories, but the films are never really about that, or at least didn't seem so to me. Those movies are all about these little quiet quiet moments, these often mundane daily events, and because of that studio's extraordinary animation, those otherwise mundane moments become filled with so much color and joy and life. Watching those scenes can make you feel happy just to be alive, and that's the true secret of their magic. Breath of the Wild feels like a 300-hour-long video game equivalent of that. The game's world is full of so much color and so much life and so much quiet joy. It's part of why I'm a bit flabbergasted when people say this game is empty or shallow. Every inch of this game's world feels absolutely full to me, and yet, as I discussed at the beginning of this video, all that peaceful gameplay can't feel at odds with the game's narrative. Breath of the Wild's story is one of deep tragedy. This is a setting where the heroes failed, where the champions of good were cut down one by one, where the bad guys were victorious, where innocent lives were destroyed, where thousands were slaughtered, where the kingdom fell to fire and ruin. Everywhere you go in this game, you see the lingering scars of a cataclysmic battle, abandoned villages, crumbling fortresses, battlefields where the earth itself has been shattered. Every time I pass a ruin in this setting, an abandoned home, an empty cobblestone street where wild grass grows between the stones and none but monsters now roam, I feel like I'm exploring a graveyard. Each ruin is like a gravestone, a monument marking where another life was lost forever. Breath of the Wild's whole world feels like one big graveyard. For all its life and light and color, it is also a melancholy setting where the twin shadows of death and ruin are ever present. As an audience, how do we reconcile these two seemingly disparate story elements? Life and death, joy and loss, color and shadow. I think the primary theme of Breath of the Wild's narrative is failure, tragedy, and disaster, but also finding a way to keep going in spite of those. Finding a reason to keep living in a tragic world. Overcoming failure, building a new life in this broken place. And not necessarily repairing all the damage that has been done, because that isn't really possible. You can't bring back all the lives that have been lost, but instead finding a way to live with the damage, with the old wounds, joyfully and peacefully. Let's look at a seemingly random background character in the game. In Hateno Village, the only Hyrulean village that escaped the devastation of the calamity mostly unscathed, you can find this old woman sitting by a tree. She speaks about the setting and history of this world, which is a relative rarity in the game. It's hard to find characters who actually say anything substantial about the setting's backstory, anything specific about how the calamity affected the lives of ordinary people who survived the devastation. She says, "When I was a child, this whole region wasn't in a state fit to be sown, much less harvested. Hyrule Castle and Castle Town had been destroyed, and all of the folks there fell victim to. Well, back in the bygone days, we called it the calamity. The words often fall meaningless when we try to describe tragic events of a certain magnitude. I didn't come along until everything was already over. I was born during the age of burning fields. By the time I was old enough to be aware of it, the plants around Hateno Village were budding. We were self-sufficient." This dialogue is so important to understanding the setting of Breath of the Wild, into its themes of both failure and overcoming failure, that I kind of can't believe it was hidden behind some random NPC in the corner of Hateno Village where it can easily be missed. I want to start with that line. Words often fall meaningless when we try to describe tragic events of a certain magnitude. There is a profound truth to this statement. Our language often fails to capture the emotions and the trauma of tragedies. It is difficult enough to describe in words how it feels when you lose a single person you love. But what about when you lose tens of thousands, when you lose entire cities and towns, when you lose your whole world in a day? What words are there for that? The word calamity specifically is not sufficient to capture the scope and terror of the tragedy the term is used to describe. I think a lot of players don't really grasp the horror and trauma of the calamity. That's at least partly because the word itself doesn't adequately grasp that horror and trauma. It's not a failure of the writers, but of the language itself. And that's part of the challenge of telling a story about a tragedy on the scale of the calamity. What words can you use to describe this disaster, to make your audience truly understand it? For the most part, Breath of the Wild doesn't use words at all. Instead, it uses the environment itself to tell the story. And that is a really effective choice, but I'll discuss that more in a bit. First, I want to keep talking to this old lady. Let's look at her lines. "When I was a child, this whole region wasn't in a state fit to be sown, much less harvested, and I was born during the age of the burning fields." The calamity battle between the soldiers and the Guardians. Didn't stop with the razing of Castle Town. Didn't stop with the destruction of so many settlements. Didn't even stop when Princess Zelda successfully sealed Ganon inside the castle. The devastation wrought during the great battles continued even after those battles were over. The fires must have raged on for weeks or even months, destroying more than the battle itself had. The earth and waters were burnt or poisoned. Wildlife must have experienced a dramatic decline. For a time, it became impossible to grow food in the ruined soil. Try to imagine this. Your home has been destroyed. Your friends and family are dead. Even when you find safety, everything has been burned. You can't grow food. And all the wild food you might scavenge has been burned. And the wildlife you might have hunted is dead or fled. And even the fish in the rivers have been poisoned by ash and debris. How do you keep going? How do you even find a reason to keep struggling, to keep on living? Wouldn't it be so much easier to just give up? And yet they didn't give up. They did keep going, as people always do. After every tragedy in our world's history, in every time, in every place, after every natural disaster, in every war, in every massacre, there are always survivors. Somehow people always find a way to keep on living. There is an inherent tenacity to life. And I think that is central to Breath of the Wild story. Understanding that tenacity, understanding why we keep going, understanding all the joy and beauty that can still be felt even after a terrible tragedy has taken so much from us. But before I dig more deeply into that, I want to talk to this old lady just a little bit more. If you ask her about Hyrule Castle, she will say, brave souls from nearby villages will all set their sights there, do great deeds, and return home draped in glory. I really like this line because it's one of the few lines of dialogue in the game that gives us any idea of what daily life in Hyrule Kingdom was like before the calamity, of their culture and what they valued. Hyrule Castle was not just at the geographic center of the kingdom, but the center of its culture too. If you had dreams, they were of Hyrule Castle. If you left home, you went to Hyrule Castle. If you wanted to become someone, make a name for yourself, find glory, you searched for it at Hyrule Castle. All eyes were pointed towards that single landmark. All those ruined and abandoned villages across the landscape. In every single one of those villages, you could have found young people with goals and aspirations, greedy for glory, hungry for success, ready to take on the world. And their eyes were pointed towards Hyrule Castle. In those same villages, you'd find older folks who had once left and later returned, who could regale others with stories of their adventures, of their careers as knights of the kingdom, of some battle or crisis they took part in. Across the whole kingdom, on all the roads and highways, you could have found people journeying to Hyrule Castle for the first time, their hearts high with hope. I think it's important to try to understand what life in Hyrule Kingdom was like so we can understand what was lost, to see the humanity within this tragedy. The story focuses so much on Link, the great fabled hero, and on Princess Zelda and on the champions, but we get so little information about the ordinary people of Hyrule Kingdom. But now we need to move on. I spoke before about how Breath of the Wild tells most of its story through its environment, through the landscape itself. So if we really want to understand the story of the calamity, and those themes of failure and overcoming failure, of the inherent tenacity of human life, we have to find it by reading the environment the same way we might read a book or analyze a painting. I want to focus on 3 specific locations in the game, and the stories those locations tell.
It's a little strange we never bother sharing names with each other.
So since we're
and the
already there,
merchant
let's
is a
start with
character
Hateno
that's
Village.
only...
Hateno Village's story actually begins far outside the village.
He presumably dies after at the end of the game, which is a big shame.
You can tell just by reading the landscape how terrible and
but who knows, you know?
Was. Examine the shape of the landscape here. Look at all these little hills and dips, the shallow puddles, the way the whole plain seems to have been pockmarked. Now, this is a photo of what the World War I battlefield of Verdun looks like today. You should immediately see the similarities. About 100 years ago, one of the most terrible battles in human history was fought here, and even 100 years later, the scars of that battle still run deep. The craters dug by tens of thousands of artillery blasts are
Alright,
still
I won't be
obvious
able
to the
to
naked
tell.
eye. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers lost their
whatever.
lives here. And this is exactly what we see in the Blatchery Plain, a landscape that never healed from the battle that was fought here, where the craters dug by the blasts from the Guardians' weapons still pockmark the landscape. The Earth itself was wounded, permanently altered. It wasn't just human lives that suffered in the calamity, it was the world too. It was the ecosystem. You can look at this landscape and see the battle that was fought here. The scars in the land will probably never fully heal. This isn't a story about healing and covering up old wounds. It's a story about learning to live with the wounds. And this battlefield is massive. Look how far it extends. Look how many husks of Guardians rest here. Next, examine the human ruins that dot this plain. Here and there you see crooked walls, archways that lead to nowhere, a lone pillar supporting nothing.
Yeah,
These buildings have been so
uses up a
thoroughly
lot of
destroyed that you
space.
can't even guess at what they might have been. Was all of this a part of Fort
the
Hateno?
Black
Could
Tail.
there have been a village
actually
here too? Something else?
super
There
small.
is no
I
way
didn't
to
realize.
know.
It's
not
only a
just that all the
2x2.
people who lived here are dead.
And it's
that
apparently
the
very
calamity
similar
even erased the
in strength than the
stories
Red
of their
9.
lives. Their stories were not written down, and these structures were completely demolished so that we cannot read their stories even in the environment. Their lives have vanished. We will never know anything about them. Much of what was lost in the calamity is simply irrecoverable, just like any other disaster. At the far end of the plain, we find this stone fortification. And this wall is really extraordinary, because it marks the calamity's greatest extent. That wave of destruction and bloodshed and terror and battle crashed into this fort and was held back long enough for Princess Zelda's magical power to shut down the Guardians. Look how many Guardians are piled up against this wall. How many were destroyed
the riot
in the way
gun
through
I
the
bought,
act of
right?
actually climbing the fortification,
The riot
or the scars
gun.
in the wall itself. And yet not a
I'm
single
sorry.
Guardian ever managed to scale
But
this
I'm actually
wall.
not
Not a
sorry.
single one reached the other side. We know that Link fought in this battle, that he destroyed many of these Guardians himself, and that it was Princess Zelda who ultimately ended the
Let me
battle
go
with
see
a
the Black
massive
Tail.
blast of magical power. But look at this wall, and think about how many soldiers must have fought on this wall. How many soldiers it would have taken to hold back a horde of Guardians for any length of time. How many heroes fought here whose names we'll never know and whose stories were never told. But even if they weren't written down, we can still see their stories. The developers stamped this story into the landscape instead. From here, we travel along the road to Hateno village itself. Notice how empty this road is, how few travelers there are, how the road is just a path worn into the dirt from frequent travel. This might as well be a rural road leading to nowhere. Today, Hateno village is the center of Hyrulean civilization, the densest human settlement in the world. But before the calamity, it was just a village on the outskirts, one of many, in an isolated
I just realized
corner of
the merchant's
frontier,
wearing a
not
mask.
even important
They don't have
enough
to bother.
warrant a cobblestone road. And then we reach Hateno village itself, and we find what all those heroes
Ah,
at the
still a
first
1.5
sacrificed their
increase.
lives
It's still
for.
gonna be a
It's
really
life,
good gun.
It's simple
All
living.
things considered.
Hateno wasn't a center of culture or knowledge. It wasn't strategically important. There isn't anything special about Hateno that makes it worth sacrificing your life for, except that it's a place where people lived. Here, farmers still till the fields. Children still run and play in the streets. Mothers still gather to gossip by the well. The windmills still turn. In spite of all that death and ruin, life goes on. I started this essay by discussing all these simple and small joys that are to be found in Breath of the Wild's world design, despite the
Why
tragedy.
not?
And I think Hateno is central to that theme. In the end, the soldiers of Hyrule didn't save the castle, and they didn't save any libraries, and they didn't save any tunnels, and they didn't save any fortresses. They saved a single village, one village, where those simple and small joys can carry
The
on.
thing is, this
I really
guy
love
really
Hateno
loves
Village.
That's like
It's
the
one of my
biggest flaw
favorite
of this gun.
locations in the game. It's so
It
peaceful,
reloads
you're so
super slowly.
relaxing. Here you don't have to imagine what life might have been like before the calamity. You can see it with your own eyes. It was simple and quiet, normal. The villagers
Everything
live
else is already
ordinary
good at just
lives
level
here,
1, so-
follow uncomplicated routines. I think there's much to be envied about life in this place. At Hateno, through the environment, we see a story of heroes facing incredible devastation, horrific tragedy, and against all odds,
If you
just
want a
barely
fighting chance
emerging
out there,
victorious.
you best
Of great
chin up your
sacrifice for
kicks.
simple rewards. Now we need to move on to a more tragic story. One of heroes failing, falling in battle. Of the soldiers who died without saving
Will that be
anything.
all
Now
you
we
come
move on
to?
to Akala Citadel. Akala is a rural frontier region full of nature and wetlands and quarries and trees with absolutely gorgeous red-colored leaves. And over all this wildlife, the massive ruined spire of Akala Citadel looms. Akala Citadel is one of the most impressive sights in all of Hyrule. Colossal stone walls that stretch high into the sky. A multi-leveled, multi-terraced fortress complex carved into the face of a cliff. Seemingly impregnable, the toughest nut to crack in all the kingdom. Once upon a time, it must have been home to hundreds of soldiers, a focal point of Hyrule's military forces. But now it is quiet. The only life to be found here today are monsters, and the trees growing from the terraces, their red-colored leaves swaying in the cold wind. First, imagine the story of its builders. A master architect must have designed this structure, one of the most impressive minds of their age, who designed a fortress that would stand for generations, and yet whose name we will never know. It would have taken months just to gather the materials from the nearby quarry, and many more months, if not years, for the craftsmen and laborers to raise the tower into the sky. Slowly, piece by piece, stone by stone, brick by brick, it rose ever higher. Imagine the pride of that architect when the final brick was set in its place. The pride of all those craftsmen and laborers to have been a part of building one of the most incredible landmarks in the land. Imagine how the hearts of everyone in Hyrule must have swelled with that pride upon seeing this testament to their power, to their strength, to their wealth, to what they could achieve when they worked together in shared and driven purpose. Imagine how safe they must have felt knowing this titanic fortress was protecting them. And now they're all gone.
You know what?
This
I'll
fortress
just
did
sell the
not
Red
protect
9 and
them.
replace it
All
with a
their
Black
power,
Tail,
all
because
their strength
I
failed
want all
during
the
the
space.
calamity. To learn more about the story of Akala Citadel, let's speak
You
to
know?
this NPC who's hanging out near the
I'll
entrance.
go empty out
He says,
the Red
"That's
9
the
now
Akala
as well.
Citadel ruins.
Look at all
Long
the
ago,
ammo
at
I
the
have
peak of
anyhow.
Hyrule's power, they built a fortress to protect Akala. It was said to be unassailable,
Do I
but during
look
the
like-
Great Calamity, Hyrule Castle fell. The army had no royalty to lead them. With no other choice, they fell back to the Citadel to make their last stand. Sadly, a concentrated assault from the out-of-control Guardians spelled the end for this fortress too. In a real sense, the Kingdom of Hyrule met its doom here. When the unthinkable occurred, when the center of their civilization, Hyrule Castle, fell, the survivors, battered and beaten, broken, fled to the Citadel. Try to picture the stream of refugees that poured into this
I
fortress
forgot
that
about
day,
the
of
sniper.
terrified villagers and townspeople who had barely escaped with their lives, of soldiers who had no kingdom left to defend and didn't know where else to go. Many of them must have been wounded. Many of them must have gotten separated from their families and loved ones, hoped to be reunited with them behind these walls. All of them must have been scared. All of them must have been in shock. All of them must have wondered, if even Hyrule Castle had fallen, what chance did Akala Citadel have of withstanding the next assault? Then imagine their growing despair as more and more guardians appeared over the horizon, unstoppable, gathered at the fortress's base. The panic, the screams, the hopeless final stand. Some must have tried to hide. Some must have thrown themselves from the walls in their attempts to escape. Some would have fought to their last breath. Maybe they even held off the first wave, the second, the third, the fourth, but the Guardians were ceaseless, innumerable. Every man, woman, and child who fled here was slaughtered. The Guardians were a merciless and compassionless enemy, inhuman. You couldn't even beg for your life. The Guardians wouldn't hear your pleas, wouldn't even understand them, and wouldn't care if they did. I talked before about how the ruins in this setting often seem like grave markers to me. Like the whole kingdom is one sprawling graveyard, and each ruin is the marker of a life lost. Well, Akala Citadel is the most massive gravestone at all, marking the final hopeless and terrifying moments of the entire kingdom. And yet, if from the top of this tower you gaze east towards Lake Akala, you'll see something very beautiful. That's Tarrytown, the first new settlement built in Hyrule Kingdom in 100 years. Beneath the shadow of this old citadel, this terrible gravestone, all those old horrors and tragedies, new life is emerging. The people of Hyrule are beginning to rebuild. Tarrytown is another of my favorite locations in the game, because you get to help build it. You get to watch this new village grow, house by house, villager by villager, from a lonely and empty plateau into a place full of life and color. If I had more time, I would talk a lot more about the Tarrytown side quest, how it represents the renewal of Hyrule, many species and cultures working together, how the wedding at the end marks not only the joining of that couple, but the moment Hyrule Kingdom itself was reborn right here in Akala, the same place it died. But this essay is already running long and we have so much more to get to. Remember, Breath of the Wild's main themes aren't just failure and tragedy, but also overcoming that failure and tragedy, which is perfectly represented by Tarrytown blossoming beneath the shadow of Akala Citadel. Next, we move to the center of Hyrule Kingdom, the epicenter of the Calamity, where all this death and destruction started, to Castle Town. We've actually been following the story in reverse order. The Calamity began at Castle Town, then spread to the surrounding settlements and fortresses, including Akala Citadel, and then was finally just barely halted at Fort Hateno by Princess Zelda's magic. For most players, Castle Town will be the last area in the game they explore, because it's the most dangerous ruin in all of Hyrule. The former capital of the greatest kingdom in the world is now a gray and featureless, lifeless wasteland, where pools of acidic malice burn anything they touch, and ancient guardians patrol these silent charnel streets, assaulting anyone foolish enough to explore this most ruined of all ruins. Castletown was the only true city of Hyrule Kingdom, the center of its culture, government, and civilization. This is where the royalty dwelt. This is where the bravest and most accomplished knights served. This is where the most learned and gifted scholars gathered. 100 years ago, the streets must have been dense and crowded and noisy and alive with hundreds of people, with the sounds of talking and shouting and music and dogs barking and children playing, and shopkeepers hawking their wares, and the thousands of footsteps and the horses' hooves clattering on the cobblestones, and the creaky wheels of the carriages and carts. And now it is utterly silent. Unlike Akala Citadel, where at least the red leaf trees still grow, here in Castle Town there is no life at all, not even trees, not even monsters. The only thing that moves here are the mechanical corrupted guardians, artificial imitations of life, death machines who serve only evil. The most remarkable thing to me about the ruins of Castle Town is how utterly and totally this place has been destroyed. Most buildings have been literally leveled to the ground, down to their very foundations. This city looks like it was hit by an atomic bomb. This is where the Calamity began, its epicenter, where it struck the hardest. And so the devastation here is visibly far worse than anywhere else. One moment, life here was as busy and colorful and noisy as ever, and then in the next, thousands of rogue guardians dropped on top of the city, clambering over the rooftops, swarming through the streets, destroying absolutely everything in sight. Castle Town was probably destroyed in minutes, if not mere seconds. It would have been horrific. Hundreds, if not thousands of children must have been killed in these streets within the first seconds of the Calamity. Burned or vaporized along with their mothers and fathers, their grandparents, even their family pets. Imagine it.
No.
One moment you're living your life, you're thinking about whatever little ordinary worries that all people think about. Money, your relationships, your family, your job, what you're going to eat for lunch that day, what you're going to do when you get home, your chores, your hobbies. And then in the next moment, absolutely everything you ever knew has been destroyed. Even if you are lucky enough to survive, your life is already gone forever. Your entire world is gone forever. Even if you survive the first few minutes, escape from the city, there is nowhere you can flee to. Nowhere you will be safe. The Guardians followed the stream of refugees that fled to Akala Citadel and slaughtered every single one of them. The Guardians scattered in every direction, carrying destruction to every village, every fortress, every lone cottage. Even if you survived, how could you find a way to keep going after this happened to you? That is the central question of Breath of the Wild story, but it's not a question unique to this game. This destruction of cities is obviously not unique to the fictional setting of Breath of the Wild. Cities all across the world, in every country, have experienced this exact type of total devastation. Cities are being destroyed in this exact way right now, this very minute, in parts of our world. Right now, lives are being destroyed, worlds are being destroyed. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people are asking that same question. How do we keep going in a world where tragedies like this keep happening? We will never see the last war or natural disaster. We will never see the last ruined city, the last stream of hopeless refugees. It's a personal question that everyone must answer for themselves, but we've already seen Breath of the Wild's answer. We've seen it written in the setting's landscapes. I spent the first part of this video showing you that answer, in all the joy and fun and peace still left to be found in this ruined world. Breath of the Wild is a world where, even after the worst of tragedies, the most horrific loss of life imaginable, you can still feel joy, still appreciate beauty, still have fun. Breath of the Wild is a world where life is tenacious, where people do not give up, where eventually, against all odds, they survive, rebuild, and even thrive beneath the shadows of the old tragedies. Before I end this video, I want to discuss Princess Zelda's story. So far, we've only looked at how Breath of the Wild tells this story through its environment. This whole time, we've had to imagine what the Hyruleans did, what emotions they felt, and infer all that from the details of the environment. But with Princess Zelda, we don't have to imagine anything.
I'm getting quite the surplus.
Zelda puts a human face on all that shock
I'm not mad about it, but
destruction, on the effects of tragedy and failure, on those themes of failure and overcoming failure. She personalizes it. She allows us to see the calamity through a single character's eyes. Now, I don't want to watch every single one of her cutscenes, because then we'd be here all day. Instead, I've curated a sequence of 4 cutscenes featuring Zelda, which I think do a really good job of telling her story. Telling the story of failure and then overcoming that failure. So let's watch the first one.
Masyado magastos, anak.
Her story. Telling the story of failure and then overcoming that failure.
I've never needed, nor have I ever wanted to have so many bolts, but up to how many can bolts and mines stack?
Incredible. We're at a point now where we can actually control them.
Oh, yeah.
At the current rate, we'll soon know all we need to know about the Guardians and the Divine Beasts. And should Ganon ever show itself again, we'll be well positioned to defend ourselves.
What are you doing out here, Zelda?
I don't think I get to go back here.
I was assessing the results of the experiment with the Guardians. These pieces of ancient technology could be quite useful against them.
I know that. They are essential to Hyrule's future, and our research demands that we keep a close eye on them. However, as the princess, you currently have a crucial but fulfilled responsibility to your kingdom. Let me ask you once more, when will you stop treating this as some sort of childish game?
I'm doing everything I can. I'll have you know that I just recently returned from the Spring of Courage, where I offered every ounce of my prayers to the goddess.
And now you are here wasting your time. You need to be dedicating every moment you have to your training. You must be single-minded in unlocking the power that will seal Calamity Ganon away.
I already am. Don't you see? There's nothing more I can do. My hope is that you allow me to contribute here in whatever way I can.
No more excuses, Zelda. Stop running away from your duty. As the king, I forbid you to have anything to do with these machines from this moment on. I command you to focus on your training. Do you know how the gossip mongers refer to you? They are out there at this moment, whispering amongst themselves. That you are the heir to a throne of nothing. Nothing but failure. It is woven into your destiny. And you prove them wrong. Do you understand?
Yes, I understand.
Breath of the
Ashley,
Wild story is
you in
very
there?
unique among the franchise in that it presents Princess Zelda as fundamentally a failure. In most other games, she is depicted as powerful, wise, in charge of whatever situation she's in. Sure, she also usually gets kidnapped, but she always has total control over her magical power. She never struggles to use her magic. That always seems second nature to her, but not in Breath of the Wild. This is a more sympathetic depiction of her character than we're used to. A character who is failing to live up to others' expectations of her, who is failing to fulfill her supposed destiny. Princess Zelda has been told that the only means of saving the kingdom lies within herself. A hidden power sleeping within her, but she doesn't have any idea how to awaken that power. She doesn't have anyone to guide her or instruct her in this. She is alone and time is running out. If she fails to awaken that power, then everything will fail. Everything will be destroyed. It doesn't help that she's been forcefully paired with Link, a warrior who has seemingly very easily fallen into his own destiny as the chosen hero. Every time she views his success, it's a reminder of her own failure. She tries to distract herself with research into the ancient guardians, studying and restoring the old Sheikah technology, which is a space where she can succeed, a place where she isn't haunted by her failure, where she can feel confident in herself.
Nice.
But then, even that safe haven is stolen from her when her father forbids her from further research into the guardians, throws her failures in her face, orders her to focus totally on her training from now on. But this is a brutal order. Imagine being ordered to spend your every waking moment working on something that you simply cannot achieve. No matter how much time you spend on it, no matter how hard you try, it would make you miserable, which is exactly what Zelda becomes, miserable. Now let's watch the next scene to see how this story of failure progresses.
I come seeking help regarding this power that has been handed down over time. Prayer will awaken my power to seal Ganon away. So I've been told all my life. And yet, Grandmother heard them. The voices from the spirit realm. And Mother said her own power would develop within me. But I don't hear or feel anything. Father has told me time and time again. He always says, quit wasting your time playing and being a scholar. Curse you. I've spent every day of my life dedicated to praying. I've pleaded to the spirits tied to the ancient gods. And still the holy powers have proven deaf to my devotion. Please, just tell me. What is it? What's wrong with me?
In this scene, we see the deep personal anguish that repeated failure can cause. How long can you fail at something before you must give up? For the sake of your own mental and emotional health, for the sake of your future. This is a serious question. This is a question that people face every single day. Everyone who's trying to accomplish anything has to answer this question. If you're trying to start a business or trying to be a professional athlete or trying to make a living as an artist or writer and it's not working, how long can you fail before you just have to give up? How many years of failure? How many failed attempts? How many rejections can you go through before you can't take anymore? What is the correct number? Failure can make you sick. Deep down inside, it can hurt you. Just as Zelda does here, you will begin to wonder what is wrong with you. What about you is broken? Why can you not do what other people have done? How can you fix it? Can it ever be fixed? In this scene, Zelda is approaching that limit. This is a character who is asking herself, how many more times can I fail? How many more times can I put myself through this? What's even the point of trying?
Hold on, Ashley.
Next, let's watch the result of all this failure.
defeated Ganon and turned them all against us. And everyone, Miva, Urbosa, Rivali, and Daruk, were trapped inside those things. It's all my fault. Our only hope for defeating Ganon is lost, all because I couldn't harness this cursed power. Everything.
Roost, I've secured Baby Eagle.
I've done up until now.
Is she okay?
It was all for nothing.
Well done, Condor 1.
So I really am just a failure. All my
Sending you the
friends,
coordinates for the
all
extraction
time
point.
kingdom.
Make your way there, and don't let anything happen to Baby Eagle.
I tried and
Hurry. The weather is getting worse. Roost out.
all the time.
Who'd have thought that if it weren't for the weather, Ashley and Leon would actually be home right now. And Sanders' plan, although it wouldn't have gone as planned, can still
The
actually
scene
work.
takes place after the calamity has begun, after Castletown has been destroyed, after the champions were killed. I talked before about how Zelda's story puts a much-needed face on the tragedy of the calamity. We've already seen the story of the destruction, the slaughter, the loss of life, the loss of everything. We've seen that story written into the environment. Notice how none of these awakened memory cutscenes actually show us almost any of the terror or destruction of the calamity. Here, the two characters are just running in the woods. There are no guardians, no explosions, no fires, no screams, no refugees, no dead bodies. These scenes don't need to show us any of that horror because we've already seen it all written into the environment. Instead, these cutscenes need to show us something that the environmental storytelling cannot do, and that's emotions. That's a single character's personal emotional reaction to all of this terror and hopelessness, which is exactly what we get from Zelda here. In some ways, in this scene, she is serving as a stand-in for the entire kingdom. It's not just her failure. It's not just her loss. Every single person in Hyrule, or at least everyone who has survived this long, is feeling the same emotion at this moment. Despair, utter and total despair and hopelessness. Zelda's character gives those feelings a face, an outlet, a simple, sympathetic character through whom we can experience those emotions ourselves. What do you think would be a more effective way of showing the emotional toll of the calamity? With a cutscene that shows thousands of people fleeing in terror from fires and destruction? Or with a cutscene like this one, that shows a single character's personal anguish, up close and intimate? Telling the story this way makes the devastation and the trauma personal, human, individual. Also, notice how many times the words fail and failure are repeated in these scenes. The writers are really hitting the audience in the head with the main theme of this story. But this isn't just a story about failure. It's also a story about overcoming failure. And that's what we'll see in this next scene.
Where the heck is Ashley right now?
Link, save yourself. Go. I'll be fine. Don't worry about me. Run.
Ah, there's nobody here.
Stay close.
Was that the power again?
Here is where Zelda's power finally awakens, and it's worth noting that her blast of magical power here saves both Hateno Village and whatever soldiers were left defending that wall we saw earlier. The difference between this and every other time she's ever tried to awaken that power is that this time she's not doing it for herself, not doing it to fulfill her father's expectations, not doing it to fulfill some ancient duty. This time she's fighting to save someone she cares about. This time she's doing it for someone else. This time it's selfless. Her power only works when she's fighting for others. And I think this is central to the story's themes. A key question of Breath of the Wild story is, how do we keep going after a tragedy? What reason can we find to keep living after we've lost everything? This scene contains a new answer to that question. And that answer has to do with companionship. Friendship, community, love. When tragedy strikes, we are reminded how much we rely on community. You can't rebuild a city all on your own. Lone survivors aren't really survivors. Zelda's power only works when she's fighting to save others because, thematically, we only overcome failure and tragedy when we overcome them together. Breath of the Wild story is a very optimistic one. In this story, when the critical moment arrives, when all hope seems lost, people do fight to save each other. And because they're fighting for others instead of for themselves, they will win. To finish this very long video, I'd like to watch just one more short scene. I want to fast forward to the very end of the game, to the secret post-credit scene that you only see if you find every single memory.
We'll make our way to Zora's domain. Divine Beast Varuta. Looks like it's stopped working. Let's investigate the situation. Mifa's father. I believe you would like to hear more about her. The least we can do is visit him, offer him some closure. Although Ganon is gone for now, there is still so much more for us to do.
I do think they stacked this. That was the largest my red herb and green herb stuff had ever been able to
Deep in
do.
my heart, that if all of us work together, we can restore Hyrule to its former glory. Perhaps even beyond. But it all must start with us. Let's be off.
This scene makes the themes of the story even more explicit. That idea that in order to overcome tragedy, we need to work together. The scene begins with Zelda saying that she wants to meet with Mifa's father to offer him some comfort, some closure, which is absolutely essential to healing from this sort of tragedy and to the grieving process. And then she very explicitly says, if we all work together, we can restore Hyrule, which is the same as saying, if we all work together, we can restore ourselves, we can heal. I believe this is the path through any tragedy. When times are easy, you can survive on your own. But when times are tough, you need a community. A lot of times I'll see people say that Breath of the Wild has no story. And that's a very perplexing statement to me. Sure, it doesn't have much in the way of long cutscenes or even much dialogue. Its characters are all pretty simple. The good guys are good and the bad guys are bad. The story itself is straightforward and easy to understand. Most of the time you're playing this game, you'll just be wandering around its world, not really interacting with any other characters, but instead finding shrines and treasures. And I can understand why. If you're not paying close attention, it can feel like there's no storytelling happening in those moments. But that's not true. The world you're exploring and playing in is the story. The world is the story. The setting is the story. Breath of the Wild's environments are dense with narrative. Almost everywhere you look, you can see this game's story. You can read it in the silent ruins, in the husks of the ancient guardians, in the battlefields where the earth itself has been scarred, and in the life that still thrives in spite of that disaster if you look closely. And everywhere you look, the same story is being told. A story about tragedy and failure, and of a people who overcame that tragedy by fighting for each other instead of for themselves.
I'm actually gonna prefer the combat knife this time around again. Or actually, no. Whatever, I can get away with having them both for now.
Life needs care every once in a while. Could be the difference between life and death. There you are, as you wished. Try that on for size. Dazzled, are you? Our craftsmanship demands no less. See how that feels, mate. A fella like yourself should notice the difference right away. Will that be all then? Come back anytime.
Very nice. Oh shit, look how many attachable mines I have. If I still somehow can't do the mansion scene, then something is seriously wrong with me. And also, beating up the frickin' doggo should be easy as well. Sure.
Hey, can we take a break?
Sorry, we need to keep moving.
Got it.
Oh, nice.
For over a decade, the original Super Mario Bros. Has been one of the most optimized speedruns out there. In the standard speedrun, there's 8 levels, each of them being played as closely to human perfection as possible, ultimately resulting in a run just under 5 minutes long.
I cannot believe it! What? How?
This is an incredibly short speedrun, filled top to bottom with ridiculously precise tricks. But the fastest playthroughs require using the warp zones that warp to World 4 and World 8. What if the player doesn't use them, and instead adds in the other 24 levels of the game as well?
Flanagan was right about the weather.
Well, there we unlock the craziness that is Super Mario Bros. Warpless. As with most games, tracking down a starting point for the first official world record is tricky. It's possible there were old records from the 90s or early 2000s that we just don't know about. Although a runner named Cam Allen reportedly finished runs in 2004, video of him isn't around today. But then, in July 2005, a player posted on the Twin Galaxies forum that he had just beaten Cam's record. That player was Andrew G.
Definitely gonna get to
To break this 14-year-old record down, it's important to understand how the levels in Super Mario Bros. Work.
If it makes you feel
As
better,
most
I
probably
will
know,
too.
the game has 8 worlds of 4 stages each. The stages ending in Dash 1 are typically standard overworld stages. Dash 2 stages are a mix of underground, underwater, and overworld levels. Dash 3 stages are unique levels with no ground beneath them. And Dash 4 stages are castle levels with the Bowser fight at the end. The gist of speedrunning this game is quite simple. Getting from the start to the end of each stage as fast as possible. G stayed as small Mario for most of this run instead of picking up the mushroom or fire flower. as it takes time to hit blocks and get power-ups, and Mario Sprite gets to figure out the mushroom can convert to avoid obstacles and navigate through the stages, it made sense to avoid getting them all together. Andrew was able to make it through the early stages quite easily. However, as the world number increased, Andrew became much more cautious and began to make some mistakes.
A little too late, Ashley.
At the start of 3-1, where he waited behind each pipe for the bottom plates to go away. In 4-4, he struggled to get down to the bottom path in the middle of the level.
Just kill us.
Castle levels in particular were a pretty big problem for Andrew. Although the layout of each stage is consistent each time you play it, positioning and patterns of the enemies within them are not. This can be seen in many stages throughout the game, especially with enemies like Koopa Troopas or Groovers, but nowhere is it more obvious than in the castle stages. These feature fire bars and other obstacles that appear in seemingly random positions each time. So, Andrew had to be prepared to react to where the obstacles were in front of him. This caused him to slow down significantly in some sections while he waited for fire to clear out of his way. The late worlds ended up being not the cleanest. 6-3 was particularly slow, as Andrew waited on essentially every platform in bullet bill shot. He died twice in World 7, in the first and third stages, and in 7-2 he had an intense battle with this blooper. In the second to last stage of the game, 8-3, he picked up a mushroom for safety so that he could avoid dying if he took a hit. And he did indeed get hit, at the end of 8-4, although this was partially because his hitbox was taller from the mushroom. After touching the axe, his run was finished, and it clocked in at 21 minutes and 18 seconds from when he took control of Mario in 1-1. It's certainly possible someone did a faster run of the complete game before this, but this seems to be the fastest time with video proof on the internet from back then. This run is pretty sloppy by today's standards, but it was good enough to be the official world record on TwinGalaxies.com in 2005, which was still one of the biggest hubs for speedrunning at that point. Andrew noted himself that it could be better. There were deaths, several hesitations, and mistakes that cost him significant time. Over the next couple of years, players tended to focus more on 80% warps instead of warpless, so Andrew's time stayed on top for quite a while. Andrew commented in February 2006 that he'd beaten his own time by about 25 seconds, and a Japanese runner named Osaka apparently got a time of around 20 minutes and 30 seconds in January 2007. However, it seems that videos for both of these runs aren't around today. What is around today, however, is a world record from Andrew G from February 2007, the first ever sub-20 minute run.
Damn.
This run is essentially a more refined version of his run from a year and a half prior. Andrew once again stayed as Small Mario for most of the run. The early worlds were yet again quite smooth, but instead of getting much more cautious or making mistakes as the worlds got higher, Andrew was confident in his ability to succeed. 6-3, for example, was like night and day in this run versus 21-18. Instead of slowing down at every platform, Andrew powered through and barely slowed down at all by strategically jumping when he needed to. World 7 this time around featured 0 deaths instead of 2, and instead of having to battle a blooper at the end of 7-2, he was able to finish smoothly.
The strength difference isn't that big, so what the heck?
World 8 was a lot cleaner as well, perhaps because Andrew had more experience with 80% warps by this point, where World 8 is played every time. In 8-1, for example, Andrew G was able to do a pipe jump at the start of the level. By landing on the front or back edge of a pipe, it's possible to jump off of the edge even when a prawn plant is up. The hitbox of a prawn plant is actually much smaller than it appears, so even though their sprites overlap, Mario is able to successfully jump off the edge without getting hit. This is an extremely precise trick, however, as you only have 3 pixels to land on the edge of each pipe. Andrew went for more of these pipe jumps in the early worlds, but wasn't able to get them. They could potentially save time over stopping before the pipe and waiting for the prawn plant to go away, but going for them was a big risk, as missing could mean dying. In this run, Andrew opted to not pick up a mushroom in 8-3 and instead just took a chance at beating 8-4 Small Mario. It worked out. He finished the run just 3 seconds under 20 minutes. Then, about a year later, Andrew came back to beat this run by another 17 seconds. A few seconds of the improvement came from 1-1. Since he submitted this run to Speed Demo's archive instead of Twin Galaxies, he was now able to use the pipe in 1-1 to skip to the end of the level, which was banned under Twin Galaxies website. The rest of the run was a bit cleaner too. The pipe jumps that he missed in the early worlds in his last run went a bit better this time. Levels like 6-3 that gave him trouble before, he was able to sprint through with no issue. However, even this run had some glaring slowdowns. He still struggled with patterns in the castle levels, and there were a few minor hiccups here and there. And he got pretty lucky to make it out of 7-1 alive. So, after a few years of grinding, Andrew had taken the record down to 1940. But this is where the record history takes a sudden turn. In most of the Western world, it was believed that Andrew's 1940 stood as the world record for more than 4 years. However, in Japan, unknown to much of the rest of the world, a group of gamers was trying to do the same thing. They posted their times on a website called Peercast, and the rules were a little bit different. The biggest one was that they were allowed to play with turbo buttons. When you held them down, you would repeatedly press the A or B button over and over, typically much faster than a human could press it. As will be shown in a couple of minutes, this came in handy in a few sections. The timing for the runs also started at different times. They started the timer when the title screen appeared, and then ended it when Peach finished her speech. Most runs in the Western world by this point, and still to this day, start when the player took control of Mario, and ended upon touching the axe at 8-4. So, all times from Peercast will be referred to this water timing for purposes of this video. Because these times are treated as equals, and instead of Andrew's run standing for more than 4 years, it stood for just over a month. According to research compiled by Blubbler, a runner named Mario Kome got a time in the upper 1940s by March 2008, and then runners Bohu Mohu, Royal Boy, and Hidori lowered it down over the next couple of years. But the only time of the video on YouTube today is Hidori's 1921, set in April 2010. Nearly 20 seconds faster than Andrew's time. Up until now, this video essentially hadn't been seen at all outside of Japan. The biggest strategy change from Hidori's run versus Andrew's was picking up the Fire Flower.
Yeah.
Although it cost a couple of seconds for Hidori to pick up the mushroom in 1-1 and the flower in 1-2, and at times the larger hitbox made Mario harder to navigate with, the benefits largely outweighed these. Defeating Bowser at the end of each world with fire causes the game to skip the bridge crumbling animation upon touching the axe, saving a couple of seconds in each of the first 7 worlds. Fire also allowed it to defeat enemies more easily, especially piranha plants. Instead of having to do tricky pipe jumps, Hidori was able to simply kill the plant with fire, then land safely on top of the pipe.
Hang on.
He picked up the time benefit of pipe jumps without actually having to perform them. This was especially important in stages like 6-2, where Hidori was able to fly through despite not doing any pipe jumps. In the water levels, Hidori used the manipulation to make his hitbox half the size it should normally be. By touching the ground, briefly ducking, then swimming before letting go of down, Mario's hitbox is only in the lower half of his body. This, combined with the already small hitbox of Hoopers, caused sections like this. The water sections featured the usage of turbo, which is what causes an asterisk to be placed next to these records in America. Hidori was able to hold down the turbo A button to swim over and over, and was quickly thrust to the top of the screen. This didn't actually save him any time, but it made the water sections a bit easier, as he could get out of the way of certain enemies more easily. In the end, Hidori hit the axe in World 8 at 1921. He would have actually been a couple of seconds faster, but he defeated Bowser in World 8 in order to skip the bridge animation and get to Peach faster. Hidori's run stood unbeaten for quite a while, but over in America, it was still widely believed that Andrew's 1940 was the fastest run out there. In November 2012, speedrunner Cosmic was able to top Andrew by 5 seconds with a 1935. His run was done on the Wii Virtual Console. Since the Virtual Console runs at a slower frame rate than any external emulator, it essentially plays in slightly slow motion. Cosmic didn't realize this at the time, but if he had played on console instead, his time would have been more like 1929 or 1930. Just like Andrew G did, Cosmic played as small Mario, and when compared to Hidori's run, he lost quite a bit of time from the bridge crumbling. He was able to get quite a few pipe jumps in stages like 5-1 and 6-2, but Hidori's firepower allowed him to do several more. However, Cosmic's run was still quite strong for playing a small Mario. The numerous pipe jumps he hit weren't easy, and he hardly had to wait in the castles with fire patterns. But in January, world-famous speedrunner Hodorubi beat both Cosmic and Hidori with fire strats. He got a 1916 on the Pure Casting board, likely with turbo, and a 1924 without turbo. The video for the 1924 is still around today, and it features a run similar to Hidori's but without turbo. He used fire strats, kept fire to the end of 8-4, and picked up a bit of time over Hidori by getting good patterns in the castle levels. With runners like Hodorubi and Cosmic dividing pressure, the scene shifted back to Andrew G, who wanted to push the time down further. After all, he was the Warps record holder, and held the Warpless record for years, even with the time disadvantage of using Small Mario. Now, it was time to see what he could do with the Fire Flower. A grind from Andrew in the middle of 2013 saw him set 5 records and bring the record down to 1915. The 1915 itself was achieved live on his Twitch stream, and after touching the axe in 8-4, Andrew went crazy. In all of these runs, Andrew got the Mushroom in 1-3 and the Fire Flower in 1-4, since they can be picked up slightly faster than in 1-1 and 1-2. He was also very aggressive with his Bowser fights, trying to slow down as little as possible while shooting fireballs. Most of these 5 records followed a similar pattern. Andrew would gain some seconds over Hodorubi early on from the better Fire Flower pickup and cleaner castle stages. But typically he'd lose the Fire Flower somewhere in the second half of the game, so he would bleed a bit of time from the bridge crumbling animations and not being able to use fire to clear enemies for pipe jumps. Andrew also started going for the wall jump in 8-4. By landing on the correct pixel in a wall, right between the separation of 2 blocks, Mario will attempt to stand in the separation for exactly 1 frame, or a 16th of a second. By then pressing jump on this 1 frame, it's possible to jump again and make it up to the pipe that you need to go into. So, to successfully pull off the wall jump, you need to land on the perfect pixel and do a frame-perfect jump you had a 60th of a second of time. That's not easy, especially at the very end of a world record-based speedrun. Going for the wall jump and getting it saves a little less than a second over the backup method of hitting the invisible block to get up to the pipe, but missing it loses the same amount of time. It's a risk that Andrew decided was worth going for. A few months later, Andrew set a time of 1912. It was yet another run where he kept fire until the second half of the game, this time 6-4, and then had to play the rest without it. However, this 1912 would end up standing for a very long time. There was no separate leaderboard in Japan beating it, no Small Mario only run from someone else, just a solid record staying on top. It was set in November 2013, and coming into the year 2015, it was still the world record. But that April, a speedrunner who played on an emulator was able to snag the
Merchant should be
record.
close by.
His name was
I'll go
Blubber,
save Adam, and then I'll go try beating the dog, and then I'll end there.
Thanks to his run, it was easy to see how valuable it was to keep the Fire Flower all the way through the game. Blubber picked up the mushroom and rolled 1-2 instead of 1-3, which is a bit slower but also a bit easier. From there through World 6, he pretty much maintained the pace of being a second or 2 behind Andrew, but once he was able to keep his Fire Flower while Andrew lost
the dog
he pulled ahead, and a faster 8-4 sealed the deal.
and the house section
Once the record was achieved,
can be saved
Blubber
for
kept trying to push
next
the time
episode.
forward. He had one distinct advantage over Andrew G's runs, however. He could control the patterns of the enemies, including the random fire in the castle levels. As it turns out, they're not so random after all.
Oh boy.
Super Mario Bros. Checks for the completion of each level every 21 frames, or about every 0.35 seconds. This system is known as the frame roll system. The best analogy for this is one created by Darby a few years back. It's as if a bus leaves the end of each level every 21 frames. Sometimes you'll be able to catch a bus while only waiting a couple of frames, but if you're just a few frames later, you might have to wait 20 or 21 frames to catch the next one. This means that in every level except for 8-4, it's only possible to gain or lose time in increments of 0.35 seconds. As it turns out, the patterns of enemies in a level directly correspond to how long has passed since the last time the console was reset. So, by arriving at a level in the same frame roll, or window of 0.35 seconds, the enemy patterns will be the same every time. Lubler was especially able to use this to his advantage in stages like 5-4 and 6-4, where he tried to arrive at the correct time to guarantee good fire patterns. This sometimes even included intentionally losing a frame roll in stages prior to the castle in order to ensure correctly the correct
hey
time.
now!
This made getting runs late into the game much more consistent.
Fuck you!
In July 2015, Lubler got the first ever sub-1910 run with a 1909, featuring a very quick last couple of worlds. However, some of the Bowser fights in particular were a bit slow, and he was losing time in World 1 for the power-up grabs, so he kept trying to take it lower. Andrew G had gone on record as saying 1905 was about as good as he thought it was good realistic.
Using your cattle.
Take it that low.
Don't mess with the cattle, I suppose. No!
You okay?
After a several month-long grind, Lubler had achieved 1905, a time Andrew had theorized years prior. In the run itself, Lubler wound up getting a bit behind his record after a slow 3-4 Bowser kill, but a fast 4-4 kill made up for it. The second half of the game was smooth too, with mostly clean Bowser kills and a nice world 8. In 8-4, he was able to do the more consistent 2-frame wall jump by walking off the pipe at the start of the room, then pressing the B button to run while in the air.
I'm
Mario's
missing one bolt. What the heck?
Positioning smaller than the pixel become
Oh,
manipulated
it's inside. It's still in the pig.
This makes it so that the correct pixel on the pipe for the wall jump is much easier to hit, and Mario now has 2 frames to jump off of it instead of just 1.
Give it
The
back.
2-frame wall jump loses about 0.3 seconds versus the
Oh,
1-frame
shit.
wall jump, but it is significantly easier to hit. Lubler stopped running worthless after this, and his record stayed on top for several months. But by late 2016, another runner was doing attempts to take it down. His name was Darby.
We're all just young boys on Twitch.
Darby was one of the most popular Mario speedrunners out there, and he had the record for the fastest completion of the game with warps by 2016. After getting the first ever 456, he decided to try to lower his warpless time. His warpless personal best at the time was 1915, 10 seconds behind the record. So he got to work to bring it down.
Or not.
I'm okay.
We did it. We did it. I can almost befriend Bowser and then stab him in the back and still be fast. If we make it past 5 or on pace with the record, that's the best one of it. No. 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 It's a thing.
Where the heck
Thing
is the
now.
my scope?
We just lost the record there. But we didn't lose the PB. Boom. Boom, boom, boom. I didn't choke it away.
A month after his grind began, Darby had taken his time down to 2 seconds behind Lubler's record. Shaving those last few seconds off, however, was going to be tricky. Making it through the middle worlds onto the end of the game was tough, especially because of the castle stages. Although the patterns could be largely controlled, it was still tricky to avoid the fire that was constantly trying to hit Mario. And the Bowser fights were even tougher. Only 2 of Mario's fireballs can be on the screen at the same time, and it takes up to 5 shots to kill him. Bowser can also jump over the shots, and various obstacles can hit them and cancel them out. Hitting Bowser with all the required fireballs while slowing down as little as possible takes incredible precision. Darby struggled to get runs to World 7, especially because of castle levels like 5-4 and 6-4. But one day in November 2016, he was able to quickly kill Bowser and break through.
I just went through that hammer.
Oh, the Blacktail doesn't have the explosives either. I thought it did. That's kinda lame.
Yes! 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 Yes!
Darbian had finally done it. Wolper's year-and-a-half reign over the world record had come to an end. In the run itself, Darbian was able to gain a frame rule in 6-3 by doing the level perfectly. Ending the stage with a 256 on the timer gives 6 fireworks, which loses time, but ending it right as the timer ticks over to a 255 gains a frame rule over a lower 255. It's undoubtedly one of the toughest frame rules to save in the entire run. He also gained time from a faster Bowser kill in 7-4, and gained about a second from not getting hit by Bowser in 8-4, ultimately resulting in a run about 1.5 seconds ahead of Wolper. Darbian was indisputably on top of the Super Mario Bros. Speedrunning scene after his 1904. He was essentially in the same position that Andrew G had been in just a few years prior, with a stranglehold over both the Warps and Warpless world records. By early 2017, Andrew G hadn't actually held a Super Mario Bros. World record in a couple of years. He decided to try playing some Warpless to see what he could do to his 1912 personal best, which was now 8 seconds behind the world record. And even though he hadn't held the record since 2015, he quickly proved he was still a top-level player. On April 22nd, 2017, Andrew had a run going that saved 2 frame rules over the first world in the world record. In both 1-3 and 1-4, he was able to accelerate quicker after grabbing power-ups. He maintained this pace for a while, and then in 4-4, he gained another frame rule from a slightly faster Bowser kill. Incredibly, Andrew was just over a second ahead of the world record halfway through the game. Andrew had intentionally delayed pressing start on the title screen to allow for this. Since the frame rule system starts counting from power on, and Andrew G was planning to get to 5-4 and 6-4 ahead of world record pace, he had to wait on the title screen to account for the patterns. It didn't affect his final time, of course, since timing starts once taking control of Mario after the title screen. He lost a frame rule over Darbian's really good 6-3, and then it was time for 6-4, 0.7 seconds ahead of the world record.
Molding a weapon to suit your specific needs.
He broke even with Darbian's record. It was the fastest he had ever completed 6-4, hence the gold split. Andrew was in a beautiful position to beat the world record. He just had to close it out in the last 2 worlds.
Got a selection. Might want to take care of any leftover
Oh no.
Going
Punisher stuff.
If you want a fighting
A few mistakes later, he was out of contention to get the world record. He was able to get a personal best of 1906, but there was still a sense of disappointment that he barely missed out on the record.
Willed him.
About a month later, Andrew was on another great run late into the game. Entering 7-4, he was about a second ahead of the world record. However, this was a 7-4 Bowser fight.
Welcome.
He fell behind, but thanks to a fast 8-4, he finished the run just 5 frames behind Darbian's world record. That's less than a tenth of a second. But Andrew G pushed onward. He had been trying for this record for months by now,
Anything
and
else
he
I
kept
can
falling
help
just
you
short at the end. That emotional roller coaster can really be taxing on a person. Andrew certainly had the
Your
ability to
weapons
get the
are in
record.
good hands.
All he could do was keep trying and wait for it all to
Starting
align.
to get an idea of your
And in
taste.
June 2017, armed with his penguin
Try that on
hat,
for
he got on a
size.
really fast pace. He gained 2 frame rolls in
We're
World
starting
1,
to get an
once again
idea
for
of
better
your
power
taste.
and grabs,
Pleasant trip.
and picked up another frame roll from a fast 2-4 Bowser kill. He was now over a second ahead of the world record. A fast 4-4 Bowser kill saved 2 more frame rolls, and all of a sudden, Andrew was almost 2 seconds ahead of the world record halfway through the game. He lost the 6-3 frame roll again, as expected, but he was still maintaining a really fast pace. Entering World 8, he was 1.4 seconds ahead. Of course, it didn't really matter how far ahead he was. His goal was to get the world record one way or another. World 8 was clean, as he used his Fire Flower to clear all the Piranha Plants and Hammer Bros out of the way. But in 8-4, he had committed to going for the more difficult one-frame wall jump. It would save him a third of a second over the record if he got it, but missing it would cost him big time. He was gonna go for broke. He nailed it, and entered the water section 1.7 seconds ahead.
Well,
Andrew was now 2 screens away from a
what
huge
can I
new
do?
world
Oh,
record.
wait a minute.
Once again, he just had to
5
close it out.
target
if you want
penetration.
a fighting chance out there, you best tune up your kit.
Also 5 target penetration. I was thinking of just maxing out the upgrade.
No! Oh! Wait, I don't know! Maybe.
Anything else I can help you with?
After he hit the axe in 8-4,
I'm a bit of
Andrew
a
kind of just sat there and thought about what just happened. He thought he had lost the record yet again.
A well-tuned
All his
weapon
efforts
can
in this
make
run
up
seemed
for
to have
a
fallen just
lack
short
of
of the last
skill.
second.
This kind of work is
But as
about
Andrew kept
finesse.
repeating how he thought he
Don't
was
get
too slow,
yourself killed.
I don't think I got it.
his chat kept telling him otherwise.
I don't think I got it.
Andrew didn't look at what they said. Maybe he was in disbelief. Or maybe he genuinely didn't know what he had just done. Even after the slow water section, even after getting hit, Andrew had still gotten the world record by nearly half a second. Years after his world records had been surpassed, Andrew G was back on top. The next serious world record competitor was another familiar name, Cosmic, the same guy who got a 1935 with Small Mario back in 2012. In 2016, he took his time down to 1912 with Small Mario. Still 7 seconds behind the record at that point, but it stands today as the fastest Small Mario worked this run. By mid-2017, shortly after Andrew got his 1903, Cosmic decided to bite the bullet and finally learn the fire strats in order to further improve his time. As expected, he was quickly able to get good with the Fire Flower. He took his personal best down to a 1905 after a bit over a month of grinding, before he decided to take his run to the next level of trying for the world record once again. It had been over 5 years since he last held it. In January 2018, Cosmic was doing a session of world record attempts. His splits were comparing against his 1905 personal best, but he ultimately did want to beat Andrew's 1903. He matched Andrew's splits through the first 3 worlds, until 4-4, where he lost the frame roll to Andrew's fast Bowser kill. So he was 0.35 seconds behind the record until 5-4, where he picked up a frame roll on the Bowser kill, bringing him back to dead even with the world record. He gained a frame roll in 7-4 from yet another fast Bowser kill, plus a few frames because Andrew's game lagged from sprite overload while Cosmic's did not. If too many hammers or other enemies are on the screen at the same time, the game lags and slows down by a handful of frames. Then it was on to 8-4, 1 frame roll and change ahead of the world record. Cosmic had over a second to gain in the last level, mostly because of Andrew's slow water section. He knew he had a great chance of getting the record right here.
Alright, even if I take damage, I can still get record. I just have to hit wall jump and not be terrible.
a new world record by a full 1.5 seconds. This was essentially the exact run that Cosmic was going for. There was still potential to take it lower with faster Bowser fights and a couple of other tricks, but Cosmic basically got everything that he wanted. This 1902 would end up standing for much longer than most of the records before it. A year and a half later, even though the Warps record had been broken 4 times since then, nobody had been able to touch Cosmic's Warpless record. The only person who came close was Hidori, the runner who got a 1921 with Turbo in 2010.